Hey friends, I'm Otis Gibbs, and this is my buddy Brenda Colladay. She's going to talk about when a historic flood hit the Grand Ole Opry.
I worked at the Grand Ole Opry almost 20 years. I was the first person who'd ever been hired really to take care of the historic collections there. There was the Opry Museum. When I first started, Roy Acuff's museum was still open. Minnie Pearl had a museum, and then there was the Ryman downtown that had museum exhibits as well. So it was my job to keep track of and preserve all of those historic collections. In Nashville, it had been raining for a couple of days, and I was absorbed because my house ended up with like 4 inches of water in the basement. Finally got some sleep, got a call the next morning that told me that my office was in Roy Acuff's house and telling me that water was starting to flood in to the basement of Roy Acuff's house. And in that house, we had our photograph collection stored. So I had to go out there and try to deal with that. And before I left, I just peeked in my basement and saw that there was water filling up my basement again as well. But I, took off and went in, and we moved the photo collection and, pulled all the drawers out and got it to higher ground, and then came back home and had 3 feet of water in my basement. So my husband was at the time, he's still my husband now, but he was at that time, he was actually on tour over in the Netherlands. And I called him, which was unheard of, to call someone's cell phone when they were in Europe because the cost of the call was going to be so high. But I just said, I need you to call everybody in town who you know and tell them to come help me because there's 3 feet of water in the basement. And it's like rising towards the electrical box, the panel where all the electrical comes in, and like I'm afraid it's going to burn the house down. So we gathered together some neighbors, and everybody came over and got buckets and started bailing with 5-gallon buckets and dumping down the bathtub and carrying it out, and and then a friend of mine had called the Ryman where she worked to see if they had a sump pump, and went and got the sump pump from the Ryman. So we finally got that going and, got that under control. And we were sitting together just like, oh, that was something, when we got a call saying that more flooding was happening out at the Opry. So we got in the car and went out there and went to everyone was in the tape library, moving all the videotapes from, the Opry, Hee Haw, the whole collection, all the syndicated shows from WSM, moving them to higher ground. By the time we got there, we would have had to have taken a boat over to the tape library. And so they were kind of giving up the ghost there, and got a call from security that the levee near where the General Jackson docks had broken, and the first building that one would encounter would be the museum that was out there at the time. So we all took off over to the museum and started opening up all the exhibit cases and pulling out all of the instruments, mainly that were like the lowest things in the cases, and carrying things up to the attic, and did that as long as we could. The first thing that I went for, it's one of my favorite artifacts, Minnie Pearl's famous Mary Jane shoes that she wore for almost 50 years. Those we pulled out, a little Jimmy Dickens guitar, so many things, Porter Wagner suits, Uncle Dave Macon's banjo, Roy Acuff's fiddle, some pretty serious, important pieces of country music history. We were just running, everybody was grabbing them, and luckily there was a pretty high attic area there that we could take things to. It was the history of the Opry from, and really the Ryman too, so dating back to, 1892 when the Ryman opened, just all of the photographs from Opryland theme park, from, all the negatives and prints from the Opry from 1925 to 2010. I mean, like 10 file cabinets full. So, security made us leave. Like we couldn't, it was just too dangerous. The Opryland area, the plaza where the Opry House is, where the museum was, where Roy Acuff's home is right next, it's located in the bend, in one of the bends of the Cumberland. So it was surrounded really on three sides by the river. There was a chance you could get trapped there and not be able to get out and get back onto Briley Parkway and get out of there. So security was really adamant that we needed to leave. And by the time we left, the water level had actually gone down some. So we thought that things were going to be okay. And the place had actually flooded in 1975, right after, the Opry House had opened. And there had been just, extensive work done by the Army Corps of Engineers building a levee system to prevent that from ever happening again. But, you can't really build for a 500-year flood. You can't. I mean, no one could build anything if that's how you had to build it. So we got in some company vehicles like WSM's trucks that they drove to events and things, and took those across Briley and parked them at a property that the company owned so they wouldn't be flooded, and just went home thinking that the water was going to go down, that it was going to be like a hellish cleanup, but that we'd get up the next morning and we would just resign ourselves to the fact that there was a lot of cleanup to do. But yeah, again, the phone rang early in the morning and everything was underwater. I mean, they opened up some dams upriver that were in need of repair, that they were afraid wouldn't withstand, the inundation. And so they sent a whole lot of water downriver to Nashville from Kentucky. So yeah, the water did cover Briley for probably like a half-mile distance. So that meant that, the Opry House, Opry Mills Mall, the hotel, everything had varying amounts of water. And it's that area is really, it's got a lot of different elevations that you really didn't notice until you started like going, oh, well, the water's clear up to the ceiling in this building. Oh, it's 3 feet high in this building. So, there were some places that you could walk into and some places that like it was over your head and you just had to wait for it to go down. I think it was about 5 days before we could get into the Opry Museum to start dealing with that. Maybe three, I don't remember. It's a long time. I'm trying to block it all out, but somewhere between 3 and 5 days that before we could safely get in. I mean, the first day I got into a boat and paddled up to what was the second floor of Roy Acuff's home where my office was. There was a balcony deck out back on the second floor, and we tied up the boat to that and stepped over it and walked into the second floor. There were a lot of things that were historic that were destroyed. I mean, but I will have to say that the Opry spent a lot of money restoring everything that could be restored that was of great or minor historic significance. I mean, if it was artist related, if it was, everything from instruments that Opry stars played, both that were part of the museum collection and things that were in people's lockers, because some musicians had left their instruments in their lockers backstage at the Opry House as well. So really, did everything that could be done, restoring. I mean, I hauled the piano that Nixon played the opening night of the Grand Ole Opry House to Marysville, Tennessee, and had it completely restored. It was an upright Steinway from like the 1908 or something, and got that restored, and guitars and anything that could be, really, we took care of.
what are you thinking? Because this is your entire life's work to preserve things like this, and now you're in this situation. What were you thinking?
I was just thinking, I mean, that every minute counted, that, there are just certain things you have to do to prevent mold, to find people who can help you, to get things into a place where no further damage will be done. And so, I mean, there was no time to do anything except just realize that, like, this is truly a time when, like, the more people you have and the more work you're doing, the more things will be saved. And so it was just lots of trying to find places to take stuff that wasn't damaged, and trying to, find conservation people who could help you deal with all different kinds of materials, from, saddles to guitars to nudie suits. So, and everybody just really stepped up and, took it as a personal mission. Like, anybody who we worked with was just like really passionate about saving these things. We ended up sending off a lot of things to the Chicago Conservation Center. Everything from the Opry backdrop that had been up at the Ryman to anything that was made of leather. Tex Ritter's saddle was one of the things that they worked on. Groon guitars, Dan Blum guitars, Joe Glazier guitars. I mean, we had stuff everywhere. Short Mountain guitars. We just had a whole cadre of luthiers helping us with that. There was a company whose name I'm not going to remember, who does disaster recovery, who took any photographs and paper that got wet and took them to Texas, where they basically freeze dried them, sucked all the liquid, turned the liquid to a gas. Well, first they packed them all up on a freezer truck and drove them to Texas, frozen, so that no more chemical reaction would happen. Did the process by which they turn all the water molecules to gas and just suck it all out, and then blast it with gamma rays to keep mold from forming. So I learned a lot about how to deal with water damaged things.
They didn't teach you that in college?
No, I mean, disaster preparedness is part of it, but those little minutia things, it was so big that it was just, one thing at a time, one day at a time. The first time that we went into the flooded area, I got into a little boat and rowed in and tethered the boat to the second floor deck of Roy Acuff's former home. The next time was in hip waders, and it was very creepy because, you just don't even, floods are so bizarre, you just can't even imagine the massiveness of it. And we're talking, there was diesel fuel in the water, I'm sure all kinds of gross stuff that you don't want to think of. You can't see, you don't know that there are snakes, or, you don't know what you're stepping on. But yeah, the second time was a friend of mine brought me a pair of hip waders for a gift, and I made quick use of those. So
they were probably hard to find right then.
They were. It was hard to find them for sure. So, when we finally were able to get into the Opry Museum, the one little bright spot in this horrible, I can talk about it and smile now, but that was a horrible experience for everybody involved. It was very traumatizing. But the one little bright spot, when we finally got to the museum and could get in, we walked in the front door, and sitting on top, there were some tables and chairs in the lobby area, and perched on top of one of the chairs was a mannequin with a Dolly Parton outfit on it. And we had gone through, and some of the maintenance guys, as we were going through, the night of the flood, and just pulling the glass out. These are big sheets of glass that you had to remove with these giant suction cups. So it took a couple of people, and it was always a huge endeavor to get those things out. But so they went through and took as many out as possible, but we couldn't get to all of the cases. So one of the cases had this Dolly Parton mannequin in there, and it had a big round base on it. So I guess it just and these conservation mannequins are made of something called ethafoam, that is this very, very compressed, stable material that doesn't have any kind of chemical reactions, so you can put costumes on it. Apparently, just like the big base and I like to say I had her so like perfectly symmetrical dressed on that mannequin that it just like bobbed and bobbed and bobbed from the very back of the museum all the way to the front lobby and just landed on a chair. And so you open up the door, and of course, if it's anybody, there's like this mannequin, pristine Dolly Parton beaded miniskirt outfit with these long beaded fringe things that like the very bottom of the miniskirt had gotten wet, but everything else was perfect. Yeah, there is a 6-foot circle of maple. We found out, like everybody had always said it was oak, but we found out after the flood it was maple. No, actually, we found out when the Ryman stage was refinished that it was maple. That's what it was. It had been cut out of the Ryman stage when the Opry moved in 1974 from Ryman Auditorium downtown out to the Opry House out, east of town. And just to have that sort of continuum of history, they took the circle of the stage floor and put it like center stage at the Grand Ole Opry House. And so it's always been there, and that's what you'll always hear people talk about, that they're standing in that circle where Hank Williams and Patsy Cline and everyone stood to sing, and it's just a nice, connection. And so, yeah, that was there. And it had been recently worked on because it was, it's old. I think that stage dated back to 1951. That's when that stage was installed at the Ryman. It had a lot of traffic. It was not too long before the flood that some consultants had come in and put some layers of marine varnish on it, just like the toughest kind of protective seal you can put on wood, what you would put on a boat. So that was very fortunate. The rest of the stage was a floating wood floor. It wasn't nailed down. It was just, like tongue and groove, I guess. And it was a disaster. I mean, it was just warped and sticking up all over the stage. But that circle of maple that was just solid as can be, and it didn't get damaged at all. I'm sure that putting that marine varnish on it did not hurt. But yeah, it was just wild. I mean, it was just the rest of the stage, we were just like, ugh. But there it was right in the middle, just holding forth. So
that's beautiful.
Yeah. One of the sort of close calls, a piece of the Opry history that was almost lost was there was a comedian singer named Archie Campbell, and people might know him best from Hee Haw, the guy who like smoked the big cigars and did the spoonerism humor like Rinder Husella and told those stories. He played the doctor and the barber on Hee Haw, but he was actually a visual artist as well, and he had painted back in the 60s his version of like backstage, on the Opry stage, all the crazy stuff that was happening, the whole good-natured riot look to the Opry, where you've got people wandering across stage, people warming up, people dancing, all this stuff. And he'd painted that, and it became like, it was reproduced to be the cover of one of the Opry's souvenir history books that they've always sold. And like back in the late 70s, they had that painting reproduced on canvas, like a big mural sized, and it was in the green room at the Opry House for years and years. And I was over at the Opry Museum during the recovery part when here come a couple of the maintenance guys carrying that, and they had just stopped the remediation company from slicing it. The flood had reached up about 4 feet in the green room, and the bottom of that mural that had been there for so long was soaking wet, and they like literally stopped someone with a box cutter who was just going to slice it up and get it out of there, because everything was just being, after a flood, you're working quickly to stop mold, and you're cutting out all the sheetrock, and, these people are just like going really fast. And so they carried it over, and that mural, we ended up, just letting it dry out. There was nothing really we could do. It was just, it was a print on canvas, and it just was going to retain the stain. But, and you can see back in the green room, if you look at that Archie Campbell mural, it's got, you can see the water level. They've put in a little marker on one of the walls, but I always like to see that, knowing that the guys looking out for it stopped it from being destroyed. And it's just another one of those survivor stories. So if you get to go backstage at the Opry, look for that water line and realize like what that meant.
And it's hanging at the actual height.
Yeah, it's exactly where it was before.
Wow.
Yeah, so you can still see, if you know what you're looking for, you can still see remnants of that flood, and you'd never guess it by looking at the stage or the pews or any of that, but that's one sign.
Yeah. When you're standing over there and you look at the river and you realize how far up you are, it just doesn't seem possible that the water could rise that high, but it did.
Yeah, it did.
All of that was underwater.
It was all underwater, yeah. Up the entire stage, and I think up to the 10th pew in the, there's pew seating in the Opry House, and I think it was like the 10th pew, the water went up that high.